Thank you for listening to this fantastic show on the Crawlspace Media Network.
We want to talk to you about another show on the Crawlspace Media Network.
You got to subscribe to Crawlspace. Crawlspace is a true crime and mystery podcast hosted by the creators of Missing Maura Murray, which happens to be us.
That's right, Tim. It's you and I. We also host Crawlspace. It runs the gamut of the true crime genre, and we try to apply our deep dive investigative techniques into cold cases and missing person cases like Brianna Maitland, Brandon Lawson. We also discuss the mystery of Suitcase Jane Doe, the Colonial Parkway Murders, and a number of other cold cases, mysteries, and just strange occurrences.
And we also converse with experts in the field of criminal psychology, law enforcement, and crime media. Want to know how to catch a liar? Or what it's like to wear a wire and get a confession from a juror in your son's wrongful murder conviction?
Crawlspace has it. Want to know what it's like to escape a serial killer just by happenstance? We got that too. So go ahead and check out Crawlspace, subscribe to it on your favorite podcast app right now. There's no reason to wait. Do it now. Now.
You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we are recording this the day after Christmas, almost at the end of this dumpster fire of a year, 2020.
I'm looking at our Christmas tree as we speak because the Christmas tree is here in the library where I record my half of our podcast.
We had a very, very nice Christmas here yesterday. We had some actually pretty decent weather. I know you guys have had snow and rain and
Yikes.
Ice and just about every awful weather thing that you could have. But we had a fairly decent day yesterday for Christmas, and we had a very, very nice time. We hope all of our listeners had an excellent holiday as well.
And we have New Year's to look forward to now.
Out with the old, in with the new, and let's hope that 2021 is much better than 2020.
How could it not be? I think anything that puts 2020 in the out bin is okay.
This will be the first year that hindsight is in fact 2020.
Wow, I like that. You're actually the first person that said that.
No, I'm not. It's all over the internet, trust me.
I credit where credit is due. Just remember, folks, you heard Kristin Dilley say it first.
Oh, and I saw it on Facebook already. So we're going to give Facebook the credit that it is due.
All right. Oh, heck, I don't want to give Facebook any credit, except thanking everybody for their support of our Mind Over Murder and Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook pages.
Yeah, and for all that 2020 has been a dumpster fire, and I know we've said this before, it is also the year that we started our podcast, and that is really, really worth something, I think. Just want to take a moment to thank you all for hanging in there with us and allowing us to bring you excellent true crime coverage and guests and stories. We have really enjoyed it. We are still learning to make our podcast the best podcast that it can possibly be, but we are proud of the work that we have done this year. We thank you all for joining us and letting us tell you some stories from the true crime trenches.
You know, if people didn't listen to the podcast, we couldn't do it. So
Exactly.
It's actually a central role.
We would not be nearly 50 episodes in if it weren't for the fact that people are listening. So thank you all very much for taking the time to listen to us, interact with us online, and send us your suggestions on cases that you would like for us to cover. It really does help to know that you're out there listening and that you are enjoying the work that we're doing, or we hope that you're enjoying the work that we're doing.
Well, if not, tell us that too.
But be nice about it.
That's right. We're all going to try to be much nicer in 2021. Speaking of 2021 and New Year's and all that kind of thing, we wanted to just urge you to stick with us. We've got some really interesting stuff coming up. We can't talk about most of it yet, and I'm not implying that the Colonial Parkway murders are going to be solved tomorrow or anything like that. There are some really interesting and, from our point of view, exciting developments in several of the cases that we're working on that are very close to our hearts. We really want to share those developments as they come to fruition.
And however CrimeCon appears, whether that's in actual in-person form in Texas or whether it is virtual, we are still planning on being there. So we do have CrimeCon to look forward to. That, of course, is always a big part of our year and a fun part of our year. So do keep up with us on that. We will most certainly be coming to you via CrimeCon some way or another, whether it's in person or virtually.
There's really a lot of great stuff going on. We are thrilled to be here, and we very, very much appreciate your support.
And we have some great guests lined up for you for 2021. So please do keep hanging in there with us and know that we are always doing our best to bring you the most interesting people that we know and have been pleased to work with.
Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah. Blessed Kwanzaa. Tell me a few holidays I'm forgetting.
Festivus for the rest of us.
Oh, that's right. Festivus for the rest of us. Absolutely.
Festivus for the rest of us.
And Happy New Year. It's all happening now.
Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder, and we will see you next time. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. And this week, Bill gets to take his turn in the hot seat and come under my rapid fire questioning and scrutiny as we do talk to him about something that we have not had much of a chance to address thus far in the podcast. And that is the circumstances under which Bill became a victim's advocate. So this episode in particular, we are focusing on none other than my partner in crime, my co-host, Bill Thomas.
Now go easy on me. I don't know if I'm prepared for all these tough questions.
Oh, no, I think you're more than capable of standing up to my rapid fire questioning and razor wit.
Okay. All right, let's let it rip.
Well, first of all, Bill, I know that a lot of our listeners are familiar with you from a lot of the advocacy work that you've done, but many of them may not know the full backstory on how you got involved with victims advocacy. And so my first question is going to be, can you talk to us a little bit about your sister, Cathy, and the circumstances under which you became involved with her murder case?
Okay. The reason I became a victim's advocate, I suppose, is because of my sister Cathy's murder, which is considered part of the Colonial Parkway Murders. So my younger sister Cathy Thomas and her girlfriend Rebecca Dowski were the first two victims in the so-called Colonial Parkway Murders. And Cathy and Becky were murdered in October 1986. Now remember, the other murders in what they believe could be a murder series hadn't happened yet. So I was informed by my parents of what had happened, and it was incredibly shocking. And at the same time, we were a bit hopeful because Cathy and Becky's bodies were found in the Colonial Parkway, which is a national park. If you are unfortunate enough to be murdered inside a national park, the FBI handles your case from day one. So we were optimistic because the FBI was the lead agency, but ultimately we found ourselves in a very frustrating situation where the case just seemed to drag on and on. Over a period of decades, my father had been our primary liaison to the FBI agents who were handling the investigation into Cathy and Becky's murder. And of course, what happened then over the first couple of years, they'd originally been looking at Cathy and Becky's murder as perhaps a hate crime directed at a lesbian couple. And they also looked at other things like, was Cathy's naval service. She was among the second class of women at the United States Naval Academy, which made her a very rare and special bird at that time. So they looked at Cathy's dating relationships with guys at the Naval Academy. They looked at her girlfriend Rebecca Dowski's relationships, the men that she had dated at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, and then she had transferred to William and Mary, so they looked at her previous boyfriend and folks like that. And we're also looking at men that had served with Cathy aboard the USS L.Y. Spear, which was a submarine tender she was assigned to as her first job when she graduated from the Naval Academy, which was homeported in Norfolk, Virginia, as well as people that she had worked with at the Atlantic Fleet headquarters, which was her next job. And then finally, when she left the Navy, just a few months before she had died, they were looking at people that she worked with at a stock brokerage, as well as her clients and people like that. So unfortunately, with the Colonial Parkway murders, there were subsequent murders that took place, and we began to feel the investigation shifting from a focus on Cathy and Becky to perhaps the idea that they could be dealing with a serial killer in the Colonial Parkway murders. And then I got much more heavily involved in the case starting in the fall of 2009.
That was several years before we met and began our professional relationship, which we can get into in a couple of minutes. At what point in her case did it become necessary for you to step forward and become an advocate, both for her and for the other members of the Colonial Parkway Murders victims' families?
Well, it almost feels like it began by chance. In the fall of 2009, I was working for AFTRA, the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. I was the executive director for the Los Angeles office. And one night around 7 o'clock, I was thinking about Cathy and Becky because it was a few weeks shy of the 23rd anniversary of their deaths. So this would have been September 2009. I thought about Cathy frequently, and it saddened me that the murder investigation had never borne any fruit. Something about the fact that it was starting to turn fall, even though Los Angeles doesn't have the fall that we do in the eastern half of the United States. It does start to get a bit cooler. You sort of have to picture me in my office. It gets to be about 7 o'clock. People have gone home. I tended to work late. I was the boss. And so people would stick their heads in and say goodnight as they headed out. And the office got quieter and quieter. So I'm sitting there kind of watching the sunset, looking out at the Hollywood sign in the distance. And I started thinking about Cathy. And I don't know. I was kind of done with my work for the evening. Something just kind of came over me. And almost on a whim, I just turned to the computer and I typed into Google Colonial Parkway Murders. And then I guess my stubborn Irishman kicked in. I started reading every single story from every single link. Some of the stories
does not surprise me at all. It does not surprise me in the least.
Yeah, there's that stubborn Irishman thing. I started reading each story, and some of them I'd seen before. Many of them I had not, because I didn't follow every single thing that happened with the Colonial Parkway murders. I started reading through these stories one by one by one between about 7 p.m. and midnight. I just sat there and read one story after another. Now, somewhere as I made my way through these stories, I ran into a story that was on the YouTube platform. And it was a local news story by the CBS affiliate in Norfolk, WTKR, Channel 3. And there was a report by a guy named Mike Mather, who was an investigative reporter. And he was reporting on a story that involved leaked crime scene photos from the Colonial Parkway murders. And I was just floored. I said, what is this? So I watched the story, which was very well done, and I've worked in film and television, as you know, and I'd worked with local news people. We represented local broadcasters across the country, so I knew a little bit about local news. And one of the things I noticed was the story was very long. It was like 5 minutes or more in length, which is a great deal of real estate for a local news station to devote to a story. When I watched this story, and I got really, really upset about these crime scene photos being out, and they'd effectively been leaked, and they were out in the public, and I knew that the crime scene photos were extremely graphic and were not just of Cathy and Becky, but of all 8 of the victims in the Colonial Parkway murders. So I got increasingly outraged as I watched this story. I watched it more than once, and then I was trying to figure out, when was this story created? Because when you look at something on YouTube, it doesn't say when the story was created. It says when it was put up on the platform. So then I found myself kind of searching for the WTKR website so I could figure out, like, when did this happen? And then, of course, my thought was, when did this happen and why don't we know about it? Why doesn't my family know about it? No one said anything about this. And, this is obviously outrageous. And the FBI clearly is embarrassed by what has happened, and they're the ones that lost control of the crime scene photos. So I made my way over to the WTKR website, and as it turns out, this had happened about a week or two before. So sometime in September 2009, the story had broken about these crime scene photos. So over the course of looking at the story again in the WTKR website, I discovered there was a second story, which was a follow-up to the first, and again, very long. And in this story, the FBI spokesman was permitted to talk about where do we go from here? How are we going to make this right? I could tell from watching the story that the spokesman was extremely uncomfortable, and I wasn't even certain he was being truthful, to be frank. And remember, I'd worked with a lot of broadcasters, and I'd also been an on-camera spokesperson for the organizations and companies I'd worked for, and I coached executives about this stuff. So I kind of knew what to look for. In the second story, it became pretty clear that this was a quid pro quo, that they had worked out a deal where the FBI would provide an on-camera spokesman who was clearly unhappy to be there in exchange for a second story, which would allow them to kind of wipe some of the egg off their face and explain how they were going to make this right to the families of the Colonial Parkway murder victims. The second story didn't make me all that much happier than the first, but as the evening then wore on, I kept digging further and further into page after page after page of stories. And then I discovered a Facebook page that was run by the Call and Haley families. Mm-hmm. And it had a very long title, something like Whatever Happened to Richard Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, ? Which was a bit of a mouthful. It was clearly run by the two families. And by the way, I have to give them a lot of credit. To my knowledge, remember, this is 11 years ago now. To my knowledge, the Call and Haley families were the first families to use social media to drive focus and attention into an unsolved murder case. I think they are the first. And one of the reasons why it had this very long title was Facebook would not allow them to use the word murder. So they didn't refer to the Colonial Parkway murders or anything like that. So that's why it had this sort of long, vague title. I was fascinated by that, and I was reading all of the posts from family members and friends and so on talking about advancements in the case. They were very upset about the crime scene photos. Over the course of that evening, I was just watching one story after another, reading all the posts and so on, and I just sort of made a decision to reach out to the Call and Haley families. Now, I didn't exactly know who was administrating the page, but it was family run. So I kind of very tentatively decided to type them a message. Now, it's important to note, after Cathy and Becky died and then the other Colonial Parkway murders took place, we had never had any contact whatsoever with any of the other families, even Rebecca Dowski's family, my sister's girlfriend. We'd never met her. It was a new relationship. We'd never met the Dowski family. So my family had never had any contact or involvement with the Colonial Parkway murders. So I wasn't sure how these other families, who had done a lot of work keeping the case alive and trying to move it forward. So I was a little tentative, but I ended up typing something which I've now written hundreds of times since, which is a little brief intro. My name is Bill Thomas. I'm the older brother of Cathy Thomas, who together with her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski, were the first two victims in the so-called Colonial Parkway murders. And I've written that sentence so many times, but that evening, I didn't know how they were going to respond. Thankfully, they responded very gracefully, and they were very welcoming. I found out later, within the next day or so, that Chris Call, Keith Call's brother, who was one of the other murder victims, contacted his older sister, Joyce Call, now Joyce Call Canada, and he said, "Did you see Keith's page?" And she said, "Well, I haven't looked at it tonight." He said, "There's a message from Bill Thomas. I think you should take a look at it." And so they read my private message, and then they responded back, and they were very friendly and welcoming, which I was relieved, because they could have been incredibly annoyed, like, who the heck are you? Where have you been for the last 23 years? Mm-hmm. And now you're writing to us. But instead, they were extremely kind and generous, and so I started exchanging messages with Joyce and Chris about their brother and about the case. And so we made a decision that weekend to do a 3-way conference call and kind of introduce ourselves. They were so great. They were wonderful, and they were friendly and enthusiastic, and they were really glad to hear from me. And so we started brainstorming about how we could work together. And one of the things I said at the time was, now remember, it had been a few days then since I had seen the story about the FBI losing control of the crime scene photos. Mm-hmm. It occurred to me, and I said to Joyce and Chris, I think we could leverage the FBI's embarrassment about the crime scene photos to force them to put resources back into the case. And they both thought that was a great idea. That sort of began to develop into a strategy which we used for a number of months. And then over the next couple of weeks, they introduced me to other family members from the Colonial Parkway Murders. So you have 8 families altogether. And so over the course of those first few weeks, I contacted the various families and introduced myself. And I started to try to build some support for the idea that if we worked together, we could leverage the FBI's embarrassment about the crime scene photos to get them to put resources back into the case. One of the early phone calls, which is, you want to talk about awkward, I ended up talking to Bob Dowski, who is Becky's older brother. Mm-hmm. And so here it is. It's 23 years after Cathy and Becky had been murdered together, and we've never spoken. And it was just so uncomfortable to start with. I mean, what do you say? And I said something to the effect of, well, Bob, I feel like this is a phone call that's probably 23 years overdue. And he acknowledged that. But again, he was gracious and kind, and because they easily could have just told me to go pound sand, but they didn't. One of the things that happened in the first couple of minutes of that phone call was, well, I understand that the girls, Cathy and Becky, may have been involved. Now, remember, 23 years have gone by, and it's not the 1980s anymore. And I find that being direct saves a tremendous amount of time. I try to be kind, but I do try to be direct. I try to let people know what it is I want. And if there's an opportunity for us to work together, we try to build some common ground. But I do try to let people know in no uncertain terms where I'm coming from. Even if we disagree, I try to do it respectfully. But right then I said, well, Bob, I'm here to tell you they were involved. And I explained that Cathy and Becky were girlfriends, and they had been involved in a romantic relationship for about 6 months, and that Cathy was a lesbian, and it appears that their younger sister, Becky, was a lesbian also, or at least was involved in a lesbian relationship with Cathy, which would have been her first, we believe, romantic relationship with a woman, and Cathy's second relationship with a woman. But we sort of just get that out in the open so that we're not talking about things, in an oblique way. One of the decisions I made in those first few days, too, in talking to these other people, was I was going to be more upfront about Cathy's sexuality and the fact that she was involved in a gay relationship, because I thought that could be important in terms of focus and perhaps moving this case forward again.
And it does sound like you were lucky enough to find yourself in the middle of a group of very forward-thinking and welcoming people who were definitely willing to take steps forward to leverage the FBI's giant oops in losing control of those crime scene photos. And for context, by the way, for our listeners who may not be aware, can you talk about how they lost control of those photos, like what precisely happened?
Sure. There are 78 extremely graphic crime scene photos that started life, as far as we know, as a series of slides. Now, remember, we're talking about a case that goes back 34 years. So I know sometimes I sound like I'm talking about ancient history here. When I speak to college and university groups, I always have to kind of offer a few caveats like that. This slideshow, which would have been in one of those Kodak carousel slide projectors that some of us may remember.
I remember those.
These were photographs that were shot by FBI and Virginia State Police photographers, color and black and white photographs of the crime scenes, the autopsies, the bodies. There were maps. They were designed to be reviewed by law enforcement personnel to develop an understanding of this Colonial Parkway murders. And of course, the Colonial Parkway murders, we've got 4 double homicides that took place in Lovers Lanes in and around Williamsburg, Virginia from 1986 to 1989. A lesbian couple, Cathy and Becky, as we talked about, followed by 3 straight couples. And the case becomes complicated. And so the idea of the slides, which were later transferred to a PowerPoint format, they are designed to allow law enforcement agents to be briefed on an overview of the Colonial Parkway murders. Ultimately, they're transferred into an electronic format. And apparently what happened, according to the FBI, is that a non-agent FBI photographer, they made a real big deal about the fact that he wasn't an agent. Mm-hmm. So therefore, he's not a sworn law enforcement officer, had taken the photographs, had stolen the photographs, let's call it what it is, when he retired from the FBI as a photographer. He was then working part-time at a place called the Mid-Atlantic Training Academy, which has since gone out of business. And the Mid-Atlantic Training Academy, this is near Norfolk, was a place where private investigators and security guards would go for training. He used the Colonial Parkway murders presentation materials as a training aid. Now, this is obviously completely illegal and inappropriate. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helps solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com. Do you like our show, Mind Over Murder, and want to create your own podcast?
Well then, let us tell you about Anchor.
First of all, it's free. And who doesn't love free, right?
I like free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer.
You can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before.
Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more platforms.
And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership.
I like the sound of that. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Right here, Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your own podcast.
You can tell them Kristin and Bill from Mind Over Murder sent you. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Apparently then, he passed away. And the photographs in this PowerPoint file remained in the hands of the Mid-Atlantic Training Academy and were being used continuously by instructors in the classes at the academy.
Wow.
A man named Fred Atwell, whose name comes up pretty frequently in connection with the Colonial Parkway murders.
Yes, it does.
You could spend hours on Atwell. Fred Atwell was invited by a friend of his to come in and speak about the Colonial Parkway murders. Now, Atwell had been a deputy sheriff in the Gloucester County Sheriff's Department, which is nearby where the Colonial Parkway murders took place. Atwell, after receiving the invitation, declined, he claims. Now, Atwell's one of these people. You can't put 100% stock in anything this guy says, because Atwell is literally a con man who was a criminal, received a pardon from the governor, became a deputy sheriff, and then ultimately became a criminal again. You couldn't make this guy up. Atwell supposedly turned down the invitation, saying, he claimed, that he had never worked on the Colonial Parkway murders, although he was around during that time. It wasn't a Gloucester County case. Atwell then claims that he was so outraged when his buddy told him, well, we have crime scene photos from the Colonial Parkway murders, trying to tempt Fred Atwell to come in and speak about the case. Atwell's claim is that he was outraged by this. I have a real hard time believing that Fred Atwell was outraged by anything. More likely was that Atwell was probably trying to extort money from the Mid-Atlantic Training Academy when he found out they had crime scene photos, which were part of an open and active investigation and had been stolen from the FBI. That's probably a more likely outcome, although I have no proof of that. Supposedly what Atwell did then, and this is what resulted in the stories that I had seen a few weeks prior, Atwell supposedly approached the FBI and the Virginia State Police and said, your crime scene photos are out in the public. And law enforcement did not believe him. Actually, it turns out that Atwell was right. And then when the FBI and the Virginia State Police supposedly refused to take action, which I actually do believe, Atwell did what he had threatened to do, which is he went to the media. Even though Atwell was a criminal, he acted as a whistleblower in this example. He hawked the story around to several different newspapers and television news operations. And Mike Mather from WTKR was the guy who bit, if you will, and ran the story, which is how the crime scene photo story got out in public.
And that is one of the many examples of times where the media has, I think, played a pretty big role in helping the Colonial Parkway murders families get their stories out and get, information and attention brought to the case. And I want to make sure that we talk about that, the role that the media has played in helping you as we continue to move along. For the benefit of our listeners who were probably not familiar with the story, what happened at that point? You got together with the other victims' families. I know there was a meeting with the FBI. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Right. So what happened was, after my initial contact with some of the other families, I wanted to gauge whether or not they were interested in participating in what I would call a pressure campaign on the FBI and the Virginia State Police to put time, attention, and resources back into the Colonial Parkway Murders case. It's worth noting here that there are 4 double homicides in the Colonial Parkway murders. 2 of them are handled by the FBI because they took place on the Colonial Parkway, which is federal property. 2 other elements of the Colonial Parkway murders cases, in other words, 2 other double homicides, had taken place off the Colonial Parkway, and they were being handled by the Virginia State Police. And then just to make things a little more complicated, they were handled by separate Virginia State Police offices. We had 2 agencies, the FBI and the Virginia State Police, handling the different aspects of the case, as well as local and county law enforcement assisting in the investigation. So it was a complicated case. What I wanted to gauge from the other families was, were they interested in participating in a pressure campaign? And everybody said yes. And the FBI knows this, and I deal primarily with the FBI because Cathy and Becky's case is an FBI case. Mm-hmm. I developed talking points for the families and coached them on how to be effective victims advocates. I don't think we used that expression back then, but spokespeople. Mm-hmm. And these were all very smart people who were very passionate about finding out what had happened to their loved ones. And so we all had this shared experience, and there was a very strong commitment on the part of the various families to doing everything we could to try to move this case forward again. It had been stalled for, 2 decades at that point. Mm-hmm. So we began this pressure campaign. And so we decided to use the opportunity of the crime scene photos leak as a way of pressuring the FBI and the Virginia State Police. So we did all these interviews, and we really railed on FBI and Virginia State Police over and over again, criticizing them for their failures in this case, and talked about how upset we were and how outrageous it was. Eventually, I began to have direct contact with the FBI, the Norfolk and Newport News offices, and actually was put in touch with the special agent in charge, a guy named A.J. Turner, Alex J. Turner, whom I liked quite a bit. Turner and I began speaking directly, and often very, very directly behind closed doors. I've butted heads with the FBI more times than I care to count. Perhaps more than I should have. But Turner, after several months of this, actually called me and said, enough. We hear you. We need you to slow down, tone it down, lighten up. We get it. And so in December of that year, this whole thing had gotten started in September, October. By December of that year, the FBI made a highly unusual step, I'm told. They offered to fly in the Colonial Parkway Murders families from around the country at FBI expense and put us up and brief us on the Colonial Parkway Murders and explain to us how they were going to move the case forward. All of this was in a reaction to this pressure campaign. The media, as you said a moment ago, Kristin, was pivotal to us. Mm-hmm. Virginia and D.C. media were very supportive of us. And I was beginning to develop more and more of an understanding of what happened in the Colonial Parkway Murders, as well as just starting my journey into this whole idea of victims advocacy. So it's funny, they actually tried to jam us up. They wanted us to come in a week before Christmas. I talked to my family and the other families, and I said, this is ridiculous. We're not going to fly in there on December 18th, a week before Christmas. A lot of us had families, and this would have involved travel, a day or two in Virginia, a day back. And I said, this is crazy. And we just said, they were really pushing us on this date. They wanted to finish this before Christmas. And I just said, no, we're not doing this. I'm not going to a meeting on December 18th and then screwing up my holiday. So we said, no. You're going to do this on our calendar. And this is where the families began to show some solidarity. And we said, something? We don't care that you're the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're 23 years into this investigation. And how about you do some things for us and on our schedule? And they were really, really surprised. And I said to, I was living in California at that time. I said to the other families, this just doesn't work for me. And I talked to my brothers and my father, who was alive at that time, and I said, this is nuts. No, they'll do it when we tell them that we're available, not based on their, we're about to all go on vacation for the last week, which they're certainly entitled to. But you don't get to dictate to the families of the murder victims, where and when you're going to meet. No, you ask us. You don't tell us. And so the families push back. And you can hear me getting a little righteous here.
I can, yeah.
The families push back. And then, something? All of a sudden, the FBI was like, oh, okay. How about, January 3rd? So we got together at the beginning of 2010 for a 5-hour presentation. And there were dozens of people in the room. I've been to a lot of meetings, and I've run a lot of meetings like this. It was the first time I'd ever been in a meeting where a lot of people were wearing a sidearm. It's just I thought,
a lot of heavily armed people in that meeting.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. It's just, I thought, well, this is not exactly what I'm used to in my professional life, where all these people wearing guns. They had suits on, but when they took off their sport coats and their suit jackets, they all had guns on. It was just weird. A.J. Turner did a 5-hour presentation, including a lengthy Q&A, and presented to us what had happened with the Colonial Parkway Murders and all the resources that were available. Interestingly, when they went through all these different developments in forensics and advanced science and databases and so on, one of the things that was very notable to me, and I know Turner did this deliberately, he would explain what these various systems were, the CODIS DNA database system, the fingerprint database system, and so on.
APHIS. Mm-hmm.
APHIS. All these acronyms, this alphabet soup, as we called it, they'd all come on board after the Colonial Parkway Murders had happened, that 1986 to 1989 timeframe. So a lot of resources that were available in 2010 had not been available back in 86 to 89 when the murders had taken place. So Turner did this very impressive, very thoughtful presentation. Most of the other people around the table didn't say very much, but I remember when we were introduced, I was very struck by the fact that there were a number of FBI lawyers in the room from Washington, D.C.
Okay.
I think they were recognizing that the FBI, and there's no way around this, so I'm going to say it, the FBI's efforts in the Colonial Parkway Murders, especially at that time, definitely came up short. and there were a lot of problems with the investigation, and mistakes, and I mean serious mistakes, had been made. I think they recognized that they were in more of a vulnerable position than they might have been comfortable with. Because I remember, what are all these attorneys doing in the room? They were in the room to make certain they didn't get in any more trouble than they were already in. We did take that opportunity to set up a dinner. The Thomas family came up with this idea. We invited all of the families. Now, this is 4 families because we're talking only about the FBI side of the case. A 5th family, the Phelps and Lauer families, the Phelps family, who were a Virginia State Police case, but had been very active and had been very outspoken in terms of their advocacy in their part of the case. They asked if they could join us. So 5 families met for a really great Mexican dinner the night before. And my dad had said he would pay for the dinner, which was very generous. So there must have been 30 or more people at this dinner. And it was a very interesting experience with some very profoundly moving moments where we went around the table and all introduced ourselves. More than a few tears were shed. And one of the things I discovered, and I hope this comes out the right way, except for the fact that our families' loved ones were murdered together, we didn't have that much in common, and we probably would have never met had it not been for the Colonial Parkway Murders. So it was very interesting. It was a very diverse group of people from a wide variety of backgrounds. One of the things we discovered was that the Thomases and the Dowskis, we were the imports, if you will. We weren't from Virginia. Cathy and Becky had both been brought there by work and school and their careers. The other 6 families were all from Virginia and had much stronger local ties to the community than we did. People had very different observations about the case. It was very, very interesting experience. I remember talking with my father and my younger brother, Jack, on the way back to Annapolis, Maryland, where my dad lived at that time. And my dad said very quietly from the back seat, referring to the Call Haley part of the case, because Keith Call and Cassandra Haley disappeared and were never found. So we don't know with 100% assuredness that they were murdered, but it's been 30 years and they never came back. So I think it's a fair assumption. But we talked about what that would be like. And I remember my father saying very quietly from the back seat, at least we know what happened to Cathy. Because one of the things I began to discover as I got to know everybody better was how excruciatingly painful a loss like this can be. I think it's actually worse for those families who have lost a loved one and then literally don't know what happened to them. They disappeared off the face of the earth. Now, when 30 years have gone by, I think it's a safe assumption that they're dead. But in the beginning, and even I remember going out for drinks after dinner with the Haley family, Mrs. Haley and her 2 daughters, and sitting there and, having a drink in the bar. And they were talking about the fact that to that day, 20 years later at that time, they were still hoping that they would walk through the door. Something just so profound about how even though the intellectual side of their brains knew that their loved ones were gone, there was still this glimmer of hope that somehow Keith and Sandy would walk through the door someday. And I don't know, were they supposed to be living on an island somewhere? I'm not quite sure. And I know it's happened every once in a while, but that hope springs eternal thing. But it was really, really striking to me how, even though it was the most remote possibility, they still held out hope. One other thing I learned that weekend was how important it was to the Call and Haley families that they ultimately find the remains of their loved one. And, you see this in other situations in the military and elsewhere, too, where even though they're gone, having their body back, however small a piece of that, means a tremendous amount. I mean, we're talking about religion and spirituality here and family ties that are so kind of fundamental. So I was finding myself learning all kinds of things about the case and about the 8 victims and their families and the profound loss. It was all very moving and kind of overwhelming in the beginning.
And at the end of that meeting, it sounds like the FBI was willing to make some, maybe not promises, that's probably too strong a word, but they were willing to make some suggestions as to how they were going to move forward from that point forward. So what is it that, because I know that this is ongoing, at some point I stepped in and we started collaborating, and I know some of this, but what were you really pushing for the FBI to do to move the case forward? What were you advocating that they do? What kind of testing did you want? Like, what did you want to see happen?
Well, we had coordinated a lot of this in advance, and I think the FBI was surprised by how organized we were. And I don't know if aggressive's the right word, although, for instance, I was very outspoken in the meeting, and Bob Dowski was also very outspoken, and others contributed as well. I don't mean to make it sound like we were the only ones that spoke up, but we had a lot of questions, and we had brainstormed quite a bit about what we wanted. And so we told them. And again, we decided we appreciated their efforts, and we appreciated the redoubled effort to move the case forward. But we had also decided we wanted certain things. And we said, we want you to put a full-time agent on this case and nothing else for the foreseeable future. And they agreed. And we said, we want all of the evidence to be tested to the limits of 2010 technology. Because remember, the case happened in 86 to 89. The science had advanced so much in those 23 years. And then, of course, now it's gone so much further in the last 11 years, as you and I talk about on Mind Over Murder quite a bit. I think we were polite and respectful, but we were firm. We said, we want a full-time agent. We want you to conduct advanced forensic testing on all of the evidence. I had written to the FBI in November with a list of items from my sister Cathy's autopsy report. And I wrote to them and I said, what is the status of advanced forensic testing on the following items? And so I had them listed out from her autopsy report. I remember thinking at the time, how weird is it that the brother of the murder victim is asking the FBI what's the status of these forensic tests instead of the opposite way around, which is them telling me. But for one reason or another, the case had badly stalled. Something the FBI wasn't very happy about. There was a guy named Brian Hanlon, who was the assistant special agent in charge. He was the one who did the interview on camera with WTKR, the guy that I thought was so incredibly uncomfortable. One of the things that Hanlon said to me was, in a moment of candor, I'm sure, he said, your sister's case is at the bottom of a very dusty pile.
Oh, I hate that.
Now, I later quoted Hanlon back to his bosses.
Oh, I bet he hated that.
Well, it is what it is.
Yeah, but he did say it.
He did say it. Now, this was one of those infuriating moments with the FBI, and we've had plenty. They actually denied that he had said that, and I stopped them, and I said, hang on for a second. This is over the phone. Hang on for a second. I want to be clear here. We're not going to do this. If you don't think that Hanlon's phrase, your sister's case is at the bottom of a very dusty pile, isn't burned into my memory, you've got another thing coming. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not going to do this. You're not going to tell me that he didn't say it, because he said it. And I don't care whether you like it or not. That's what he said. And as painful as it was for me to hear it, I actually appreciated his honesty. But I said, I won't treat you like idiots, but don't you dare treat me like an idiot. I know what Hanlon said. I'm ready to move forward, but don't tell me that Brian Hanlon didn't say what he said. And there was like this long pause at the other end of the phone. And then we move forward. And I've had plenty of headbutting moments like that with the FBI. And I don't think they're terribly comfortable being spoken to that way, but I'm not either. So if you treat me like an idiot, I'm going to respond with some heat. And if you refuse to answer my questions, which they've done many times, I'm not just going to roll over and pretend that's okay. I'm going to say, something, you guys want to know everything I'm hearing and everything that is coming to us, but yet you refuse to answer the most basic questions. Don't think that that's okay. This is very much, the FBI way.
Yeah. And over the years that you and I have been working together, I've seen this firsthand. This is, very definitely something that you guys have a push-pull relationship, and it is very clear that they want to give as little as possible and get as much in return.
Yeah.
And maybe that's
absolutely.
a little impolitic of me to say. Maybe that's going to put me on the, the FBI's. That's going to put me on the FBI's bad side right now, probably. But, certainly at this point, we've been doing this 5, almost 6 years. I've heard many a frustrated discussion about what the FBI has said recently.
Join the club. We're not on the FBI Christmas card list.
Yeah, no. Thanks for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. Join us again next week as we continue our conversation with Bill Thomas about his work in victims advocacy and the Colonial Parkway murders. Thanks for listening.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.